Hey, Nick Artigo here. I'm going to talk about principles of alignment in yoga, especially yoga for runners. We tend to sometimes in the field of yoga have a bunch of rules and regulations or guidelines that can be kind of confusing about alignment in certain postures. The way I like to go about alignment in anything really, including yoga, any physical movement, but the way I like to go about it is thinking of it in terms of principles. So if you look for the common principles, you can apply them to every situation and not have to memorize a certain set of rules where in this pose the foot's at this angle and in that pose the hand's at that angle. I like to go with principles because a few simple principles can be applied to every situation. And the principle that I look at first typically is how the joints in the body are aligned and what their function is. So there's this idea of stability and this idea of mobility. And the way that our bodies are stacked up, we tend to have an alternating function of each joint. So for example, the ankle is highly mobile. It moves in lots of different directions. So if you look at my ankle, I can go back and forth, side to side, all these different, my ankle's moving in many different planes, many different directions. It's meant for lots of mobility. If I look at the knee, it's kind of a hinge. It goes back and forth, back and forth. There's a slight bit of rotation. There's a slight bit of tibial and fibular rotation at the knee, but it's not a whole lot. It's primarily that hinge motion where it gets most of its motion. If I go to the hip can move many different directions. So I can move my hip up, back, in, out. I can rotate it. All those different directions the hip can move. It's meant for lots of mobility. If I look at the lower spine is primarily a hinge. I can bend it forward. You see it's there. The lower spine, the lumbar spine is primarily a hinge. It does have, each segment at the lower spine does have a couple of degrees of rotation, but the upper spine is where rotation is more meant to happen. So up in the upper spine, the thoracic spine, the part that's even with the rib cage, I can get a lot more rotation and turn my shoulders there if my posture is good. If my posture is here, if I have the head forward and I have a little bit of this rounded shoulder shape in my upper spine, they call that kyphosis. If I have kyphosis, I'm very limited in the amount of rotation I can get. That becomes important in yoga postures where sometimes a modern environment takes away hip mobility and it takes away thoracic spine mobility, the upper spine mobility. So what we end up with in a yoga class is people who sit at a desk. The hips are tight, the thoracic spine is tight, lack of hip mobility, lack of thoracic spine mobility. Those are the two main places where the body is meant to get its rotation. You get into a yoga class, there's limits in the mobility there. You start trying to do postures, and when you have limits in the places where the mobility is supposed to come from, you tend to put stress on the places where the mobility is not supposed to come from, like the knees and like the lower back. So the place where you might see this, say hip mobility, sometimes if you try to do a lotus pose where this foot comes over to the opposite thigh and vice versa, and if you lack the hip mobility to do that properly and you force it, you're very likely to injure your knee. Another place where you'll see this is any rotational posture in yoga. So there are seated rotations. So if I'm in this position and I'm here, if I can get my chest up and nice long spine in the upper spine, I can get rotation from the upper spine where it belongs. If I have tight hips, my pelvis tucks under, it's virtually impossible for me to even lengthen my spine. And if I try to rotate from this position, I'm really just cranking on the lower back. So if you can't lengthen your spine, you don't need to be rotating it. You need to work on length first. Length so that you can rotate. If you try to rotate your spine without having it in neutral at full length, very likely to injure yourself. In fact, one of the main ways that you can injure a disc in the lower spine is to put it under compressive load, in flexion, and then rotate it. So, compressive load, I've got the weight of my body, seated position. When you're seated, there's actually more compression typically in the lumbar spine, about 50% more compression in the lower discs of your lumbar spine than when you're standing. So 50% more compression. I'm seated, spine is flexed because maybe my hamstrings and hip rotators are tight, and then I can't lengthen my spine in the upper part, so I've got to derive the rotation from the lower part. So that would be a way. If you ask me, hey Nick, how do I rupture a disc? I would say tuck your tailbone under, flex, put some compression on and rotate the hell out of it. Looks kind of like a yoga posture when you don't have the right hip mobility. So you want to develop that hip mobility, always have the spine nice and long. So how would you do that? If you're in a seated position, you want to work first on being able to get length in the spine. So if you can't get length in the spine, don't start rotating. Don't start rotating until you have full length, unless you want an injury. So that's how we apply the principles of alignment, more so than a bunch of little rules. And that principle is the stability mobility principle, meaning certain joints are meant to give you mobility. Certain joints in their layout, in their design, are meant to give you stability and just kind of move kind of like a hinge. And if you misuse that, if you don't respect the design, if you don't respect how it's laid out, you're going to cause undue wear and tear and injure yourself. So I hope you got some benefit from this video. In this series, we're going to go through lots of yoga poses and apply these principles to all the poses so that you know the principles of alignment. If you know the principles, you can apply it to every situation, on or off the mat. If you got any benefit from this, leave a comment below. If you'd like to get more content that's not available on the blog or the regular YouTube channel, then click the link that's connected with this video and you'll have a chance to sign up for the Run Better Now VIP Club and you get instant access to all that content. Thank you.